So I think you heard Jeff's presentation talking about the connectivity paradox. The greater the connectivity of any organization, the greater the business advantage, the greater insight, greater control, greater efficiency, and the ugly underside, which is basically cyber risk exposure. I'll let our slide in the background kind of introduce us. Derek Harp had the flu, and now his whole family has the flu, and so he's back home resting. The paradox leads us to this metaphor of the moat. So when you think of a castle and the moat and a drawbridge, that's the classic 1990s network in terms of 1 point in, 1 point out. And under that model, it makes really powerful economic sense to embrace specialization and even cost because you're protecting the entire network. So you can add the drawbridge operator. You can add people who are trying to view and analyze the intentions of people coming in. That model for the last 20, 30 years has become increasingly complex and costly based on that north-south, it's called, assumption. So about 10 years ago, all kinds of organizations started attaching devices of all kinds to the internet. Some of these devices are operating firmware that's never been developed. So if you think about it, every device that you've ever had in your life, your computer, your phone, is likely 5 or 10 times more secure than some of these devices that never had updates and were never designed with any security in mind. So we've seen this growth. The estimates are in the billions. So now the connectivity goes from this castle in the single point to every point of control in that castle. That castle could be a hospital, could be a factory, it could be a voting precinct. And with the exposure to the internet, you now have these billions of devices creating this massive attack surface. And then the access between all these devices creates an even bigger problem, which is the attack vector sprawl problem. And so before I turn this over with the questions, I'd like to play a quick video that kind of illustrates and I think Mel Brooks saw this issue many decades ago, but the whole problem of securing against billions, if not trillions, of attack vectors into a network. Can we throw that slide up? Might bring back some memories here. So if there's one scene, one image, I want you to take a look at this.
The Pecha Thruway. Now what'll that asshole think of next? Has anybody got a dime?
I don't know, James.
Somebody's got to go back and get a shitload of dimes.
So you got the problem, right? The hackers are a lot smarter than the cowboys, right, in this area. And they're not relying on north, south, and trying to figure out. And in many cases, they have hacked the firewalls and the VPNs. You've seen the security advisories. So we've had devastating attacks, the most devastating cyber attacks in history in the last 2 years. One was not Pecha, Russians were attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. We talked about it on my panel 3 years ago. And oops, it spread all over. It affected Maersk Shipping, Federal Express. It took down hospitals, hundreds of hospitals, all by accident because of this attack surface and the vectors. So brought Ann and Steve here to let's drill down into like the problems and the issues and the dynamics of this situation. So why don't we first talk about IoT and IIoT? What do they stand for? What do they mean? And why are they different?
So IoT, Internet of Things, I think everybody understands that. And the first I is industrial Internet of Things. There's also another phrase, OT. Everybody know what OT stands for as an operational technology? Because that's sort of the broad umbrella over IoT, in fact. So really what we're talking about are the control systems that are either in a factory or in a building, a commercial building like this. And they all started going digital in the 80s, and then in the 90s, they all became networked. And today, they're all networked, some of them wireless, and as was being pointed out, they are accessible over the internet. So that's to sort of answer the question about the definition, the scope.
So from a security standpoint, over the last few years, what's really raised awareness brought awareness forward around this issue?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, first the incidents, right? And then the fact that, well, I mean, it proliferates, right? So we have billions now, pretty much, of devices spinning out in buildings, in homes, and I think it disrupts the way we've been thinking. And I mean, as Greg showed in the video, what is interesting is that it seems that the hackers found ways to get around the infrastructure to get to these devices, while we as IT people and technology people, we have not really challenged our thinking and really thought differently about the technology that we're putting together to protect those devices. So.
And I talked a little bit about the attacks, not Pecha, but there's been others. Security vulnerability from VxWorks, which is in billions of embedded devices across industrial controls, military, power, building controls. What are the implications of this, and how does our security thinking need to kind of change to address this issue?
So in enterprise IT, which is, we're all, as business people, we have our computer systems, whether they're premise-based or cloud-based. Cybersecurity has been an issue for at least 2 decades at some level. And the spending right now is about $150 billion a year to try to protect these systems, and growing. When you're talking about the world of IoT, it's as much a technical challenge, it's as much a cultural challenge as it is a technical one. Culturally, IoT systems are designed to do a function. Keep your building comfortable, secure the doors, turn the lights on and off, irrigate the grass. The companies that build and design these systems are thinking function first. And whoever thought that these things would get hacked 10, 15 years ago, nobody thought they were going to get hacked. Now it's routine. It's happening every single day. When the latest statistic I heard is that they put a new IoT system online, within 15 minutes it's being discovered. And so ransomware is one of the top vulnerabilities. And so when you have ransomware hit a control system in a building, let's say it's controlling all the air conditioning, it all stops. Now there's a certain amount of manual controls that they can do to keep the building sort of up, but to rebuild that server can take weeks. And I was up in Toronto last week, and there was virtually a brand new building that had their control system, a large office tower, that got hit with a ransomware, and the vendor was called in to rebuild it, and they sent the owner a little check, $75,000, to rebuild the database. So it's truly happening, and because these systems are all being accessible over the internet.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, it's more than just thinking. I mean, that's, yesterday we heard the technology that we rely upon for connecting ourselves to the internet was not built with trust or security in mind, right? We rely on very old protocols and things like that were not made for our world of today, right, with all those devices. So I think there must be some changes happening, and I hope the CTO Challenge will come up with interesting ideas here. But in terms of, there is, I mean, as you say, the culture, I mean, we have to, I mean, it's not just about, just educating people, but because I think there is some sort of education, but really thinking differently and really coming up with solutions that have security by design, right? I think, a lot of us forget that, security is no longer like Band-Aids, right? Like firewalls. I mean, you fix after the fact, right? A lot of people have built like those firewalls or mechanisms that just like address some points, but in our world, I mean, there is no borders, there is no wall, we are all connected all the time, everything is invisible, so you have to rethink completely about security. And also, I mean, one of the big, and maybe we're going to talk more about that, but I think one of the big things, and I think Vanessa yesterday talked a little bit about that I mean, whatever you do, security is never going to be perfect, right? So things are going to happen, so let's get ready for bad stuff to happen. And I think that's a big, maybe thinking that has to change, that it's not about applying Band-Aid and think that, oh yeah, we are secure, we're fine, right? It's something bad is going to happen.
And oftentimes in the background is that question of like, how did this happen? And with all the money spent on security, why isn't it better? Well, first of all, most of the firewalls and IPS systems, et cetera, were architected to address the 1990s era scenarios and then the problems around TCP/IP. So when you had that north-south issue and focus, complexity wasn't a problem. Certification, skills are not a problem, but as we brought up, you have culture issues now. You have OT Purdue model, IT OSI stack, you have conflicting cultures, and then conflicting skill requirements. So now instead of one single drawbridge around that castle with the moat, you now have almost an infinite amount of drawbridges. And so the network security vendors love the idea of selling you a firewall for every 5 or 10 attack vectors. They love that. And they've almost evolved into like a pharmaceutical. We'd rather treat the symptom and monetize it than solve the problem. And that's part of the reason behind the CTO challenge. So I saw a factoid in Forbes that about 170 new devices are being connected per second. Maybe we can talk about like device visibility, like how much of this do we know versus how much of it we kind of know.
Right. So the company that I started in the beginning of this year, we're aiming at this space and building control systems in the commercial real estate industry. And it's been fascinating to talk to some of the largest building owners in the United States. And what I've learned, the very basics, when you ask them the question, do you know what systems you actually have in your buildings? The answer is no. They really don't. They have an idea, but you can't protect something that you don't know is there. So it starts with, you have to have that basic awareness of what you have. And then number two, you got to know who can talk to these systems. So they can't answer who has access. The individual system may have a record of it, but as a property manager, you can't just pull that stuff out easily and say, okay, I know this. And you're talking about it, just to put things in context, if you have 100 buildings that you own, the chances are you have 4 or 5 different networked control systems in each of those buildings. So that's over 500 systems that you need to know about. And among those 500 systems, you probably have 200 different vendors. Now, manufacturer-wise, you may only have a dozen. But those manufacturers are selling to local contractors and systems integrators who install and support these things. Who keeps track of what those vendors are doing and their employees? There's a huge, huge vendor management issue, risk issue associated with these control systems, and there are no easy way to manage that risk. As an employee of a company, your IT department puts a lot of restrictions around your passwords, your access. They might invoke multi-factor. It's all kinds of controls that businesses try to do to manage the use of these systems. None of that is happening in the buildings across the United States and really across the world. This is a worldwide problem. And it's just so much more complicated by the sheer volume and fragmentation of this industry. It's a huge problem to solve. And these systems are getting penetrated every day now. So, but it's amazing that the building owners don't have the fundamental awareness of what they have and who has access to it. And that example of the ransomware, they don't even know if they have a backup, let alone where that backup sits. In most cases, it sits on the same server that just got hit with ransomware, which is why they don't have a backup. Okay? So that's the reality on the ground, and it's a scary problem.
Anne, did you want to?
I mean, no, not much. I mean, maybe I wanted to touch a little bit about privacy as well, because we work with commercial building owners, and I think one of the things that, I mean, as Steve mentioned, I mean, in most the IT department of building owners, they don't know which device they have, and and sometimes maybe if they know, they don't even know what information those devices are collecting and what information those devices are sending, and this is, in some cases, if you just think about surveillance cameras or video recording devices or whatever, audio recording devices, I mean, you better know what those devices are sending to where, just to protect yourself against, from regulatory compliance issues or whatever. So
I was talking to someone here yesterday about the not Pecha, because an advisory went out in Europe either today or yesterday that they were seeing variants of not Pecha. And so not Pecha was the one targeting Ukrainian infrastructure that then accidentally spread into the UK healthcare system, into shipping lanes, and it caused several companies to have reportable, events that they had to report to their shareholders. But the speculation is that there were thousands of others, like medical clinics, factories, where they had the problem, but they weren't obligated to report it. So it's a little bit like a tip of the iceberg. Now they're saying that the attackers have evolved, and they're seeing variants of not Pecha's architecture, but they aren't designed for ransomware, but for physical destruction, period. And if you read Wired and some of the history of not Pecha that's available, they'll talk about the motives of the attackers moving from pure financial to blackmail to destruction without any sanctity for human life. In other words, when you attack a power station and you create an event that literally could kill people. So they've seen that progression. So with that in mind, what do you guys see as like the most disturbing risk scenarios from this situation kind of evolving?
Disturbing. I don't know. Maybe you start. I don't know. I have a lot. I don't know which one is the most.
So life safety is probably the biggest concern. Is that if you get into the security system and can control the doors, that creates a real major problem. If you're talking about data centers and can shut down an entire data center by getting into the environmental system. So the notion is the first thing they get into that system, they disable all the alarms. So now any kind of remote alarming is you don't even know you have a problem. And now you raise the temperature in that data center, and all of a sudden all these servers start failing on you. That's a pretty catastrophic situation. And so that's the kind of real world threat that's out there right now, for sure.
Yeah, I would say, I think we've heard a lot of catastrophic things here, but I think I would add a little bit more that I think as we become more dependent on all these devices and things that are connected, I think it's pretty probable that hackers working together could just shut down countries. We've seen cities or being shut down completely because, entire systems that cities rely upon are just gone, right, from connectivity. So I think that could be the same, right? And I've recently read this awful comics where it's talking about somebody attacking all the systems and pulling out all the data, and suddenly like humanity is left without nothing, no data and no knowledge and no history, and you feel like, maybe, you could project yourself in a scenario where this could happen actually.
And there's a great podcast on cyber war and IoT, and Mark and Evan are on it with Phil Lohaus from American Enterprise Institute. And one of the pearls of wisdom that comes out is that it's a safe assumption when it comes to power and water grid and maybe elections, that the bad guys are already in. So what do you do next, right? So we've got about 7 minutes left, and I think I see some people out at the microphones, and I don't know who was first, but Okay,
You just said it. The bad guys are already in, and we just heard today that an increasing amount of internet traffic has been directly or indirectly contributed to IoT, intrusion, stuff like that. So what I'm asking myself, and the question to you guys, it's being a threat, but at the same time, a portion of intrusion is run and paid by directly or indirectly by certain government agencies around the world. So cyber war says, we have to be able to attack, but we also have to be able to attend. What I'm thinking, listening to you guys, is, I'm German, and Europe is very slow in adopting technologies there, and that's why we passed a law that companies have to, be forced to put measures out. You living in a country where I'm pretty convinced that you have there are certain agencies that know exactly where are devices that could be infiltrated, that could be attacked. China does that, Russia does that. So what I'm asking is, we calling for the regulator to fix the problem, but at the same time, somebody somewhere in certain governments also know where the attack devices are, and they probably have created measures to do something against it. So isn't there the responsibility of regulators to say, we should do something about it, and we know what can be done, and we know where the devices are that are infected. So if you could do more than just saying, the public should do something, or the company should do something about it. I think the vulnerability, sorry for my English, is known in many cases. We have that in exploits. Exploits of Microsoft, whatever it is, they have a value, and government agencies know this value. So somewhere in between, I think government agencies can do more in helping us to close those holes. What do you think of that? Absolutely.
Now, there's a couple dynamics, and you're well aware, I could tell by your question, of advanced persistent threats and things that get in and can be undetected until they need to be utilized.
Exactly.
So you have that dynamic. Then there's also, to the point that Steve brought up, this kind of undetected aspect of devices that have been connected for decades that I mentioned, the VxWorks vulnerability. Armis, a security firm, conducted an audit, and they determined that there were about 200 to 400 million of these 4 billion devices that can't be updated because they're firmware and they weren't designed and attached to the internet. It would be hard for any regulatory body to address that. I think the problem requires a certain level of focus, a wartime footing, where you focus on, let's say, elections, you focus on healthcare, you focus on utilities and water first, and get those locked down, because this problem is probably bigger than Google Ventures, solving. And so I think we have to start now, the regulatory agency should start now focusing on those critical verticals.
And may I add something? So I think it's also not just regulatory things that need to happen. I think as hackers work together, why don't we work better together, just to defend ourselves? I think there is a need, and we've seen that with a lot of topics here, right? I think there is a need for ourselves to just put our minds together to really go against those guys, because it's not just one company or one thing that is going to be able to defeat those guys. It's more like, let's come up together and share things, because it's at the point where it doesn't, we are not competing against each other just for that, right? We all want to be secure, and we all need to be secure just to be successful. So that's my...
Yeah. So I would add that from a cyber perspective, there isn't a standard, a regulatory standard of some sort. In energy of Energy Star, you have LEED certification for buildings, another version of energy. There isn't something like that for protecting control systems. And that is something industry groups could get around and create something so that building owners, and whether you're an industrial or a commercial operation, you could qualify your facility and your operations to meet that standard. Because there's just a fundamental awareness problem here across the industry that has to be addressed. And it's both, it's at the supplier level, it's on the on the owner level. And we got to do something about it because these systems are, like I said, are enormously vulnerable.
We have 2 minutes left. I see 2 people over here, or is there?
I'll make mine pretty quick. You talked a lot about taking down the control systems and taking down the infrastructure controlled by the IoT. What about using the IoT as an attack vector to things like the intellectual property? So are we seeing much of that, and how big a threat is that? Is that a growing threat relative to other threats? I think about in my own house, my swimming pool is internet connected. It's not very well protected.
Right.
Is my swimming pool now spying on my personal data that I'm using on my local network? That kind of thing.
That's right. I was talking to someone who's in this audience right now about a bunch of home devices being put behind a firewall at their house, and the devices were pinging back to China as discovery. I won't embarrass who that person is, but no, that's an issue.
Yeah. So a very real-world example, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab announced in July of this year that they got hacked. And if you're familiar with a little IoT device called the Raspberry Pi, any of you heard of these? Right? They're under $50. You can actually get them under $20. And one of the engineers had put it on the corporate network, and it got discovered. And then once they got on the network, they jumped and pulled down plans like the Mars rover. That attack vector is a very real problem, because a lot of these control systems are connected at various points to the corporate network. So they may not be caring about doing something to your HVAC, but they definitely, if there's valuable data that the business or organization has, this is a much easier way for them to get in.
David?
2 quick things and then a question. First off, a couple of books that are related to this. One is Frederick Pohl's classic called The Cool War. That's COOL. And it's about basically if the Cold War had gone into tit-for-tat sabotage. And I think it's well worth having at the back of our minds. Another is Ghost Fleet by Peter Singer, and all of the military officers have read that. And that's also about inveigled sabotage leading to war. One thing, as long as you guys are in town here, 200 meters that way is a famous place called the Torrey Pines Glider Port. It is well worth a visit if you get a chance. And if not this year, then next year, because it will still be 200 meters away. Finally, my question is, do you think things would be better if we simply reduced by an order of magnitude the number of bots that are using American computers and serving as base of operations for many of these plagues? In other words, if the next president of the United States went up, and let me lift my voice up into a feminine register, if the next president of the United States were to say it is a matter of national patriotism that all of us simply get the latest bot removal software.
Well, I'm not sure in terms of industrial devices how much of that could be accomplished, especially with the stuff that can't be updated. And I know we're out of time, but maybe we can answer David quickly.
I'm not sure I wouldn't say it's enough. Bots are a good way for people to get stuff done, but there are other ways we've seen in attacks, right?
It's distributed denial attacks from bots, but they can come in through these vectors without having to even do that. They can use a single compromised device.
The studies that we've looked at, anywhere from 60 to 90% of all breaches are a result of we, the people, and on either not doing silly things through ignorance, not following, not even being aware of what we should be doing. It's us. It's getting us to take this seriously and having good practices. Change your password on a regular basis. Those are the kinds of things that are going to make a difference.
Don't change your passwords until you're breached. Passwords are like shoes. Change them when they wear out.
Anyway, we're out of time. The hook's going to come, but Anne, thank you. Steve, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.